whatsoever about their crimes. It's simply that they are now in hiding, and when they come out of hiding, they will be tried themselves for murder. In the meantime, there is a lawful ancillary proceeding that can be taken against their property. It is less drastic than proceedings that can be taken elsewhere in the democratic world. And when Jeff says that this is not according to law, he's frankly wrong. It is legislation that is in effect in Israel. It does stem from British legislation from 1945, and that is why it is in effect both in Israel and in the West Bank, and that comes from Britain, which last I checked is also a democratic country.
Okay, let me just introduce our third guest at this point, who has managed to join us from Ramallah in the occupied West Bank. Bill Van Esvelt, an Israel and Palestine researcher at Human Rights Watch, also a specialist in human rights law and armed conflict. Good to have you join us on the programme, Bill. I don't know if you caught what Avi Bell was saying there. He was saying that these demolitions of the homes of the suspected terrorists is a lawful proceeding. These are lawful proceedings against their property, and there is legislation that allows this. What are your thoughts on this kind of punitive demolition?
Well, we would just apply some pretty basic and obvious rules from the international bodies of law that are applicable to situations of occupation. One is the Geneva Conventions, which very clearly prohibit any acts of collective punishment, which are just defined as punitive measures taken against people who are not themselves responsible for the crime or alleged crime. That's spelled out pretty clearly in black and white. The Israeli High Court of Justice, or Supreme Court, has kind of gotten around that more or less by deferring to the military on the basis of emergency regulations dating back to 1945, but it's still very black and white in the Geneva Conventions, to which Israel is a state party. The other issue, of course, is human rights law. Human rights law, which the entire world, apart from Israel, acknowledges applies in situations of occupation, like the West Bank. You are required to take basic due process measures to ensure that people have the right to defend themselves in a court. And just having a hearing in absentia without an actual conviction is not really enough by a long shot. It's something that has to be done with the right to challenge the evidence against you.
Okay, well, let's take a look at the international law here. Under the 1949 Geneva Conventions, any form of collective punishment is considered a war crime. Article 53 of the 4th Geneva Convention states, any destruction by the occupying power of real or personal property belonging individually or collectively to private persons is prohibited, except where such destruction is rendered absolutely necessary by military operations. Worth mentioning too is the issue of Israeli settlements. Here, Article 49 of the 4th Geneva Convention determines that the occupying power shall not transfer parts of its own civilian population into territories it occupies. Now, Jeff, obviously the legality of settlements has long been debated. As far as the legality of the Israeli policy of destroying homes as a deterrence, you heard what Avi had to say there. What do you say about how this applies under the Geneva Conventions?
Well, of course, it's all illegal, as Bill says, under the Geneva Conventions. It's clear. The problem is, and this is our fight all these years with the Israeli courts, is they don't recognize the Geneva Conventions as applying to the occupied territories. Israel's claimed since 1967 that there is no occupation, that these are disputed lands, they're administered territories. The Palestinians have no claim to the land because they never had sovereignty over it. And so Israel's been able to simply erase international law, and then within that bubble, Israel simply applies its own law, and again, it's not law.
Okay, let me get a response from Avi to that.
Emergency regulations.
This is not law. You're just applying your own responses, not you personally. Obviously, the Israeli government is applying its own responses to this.
Unfortunately, Jeff is lying again. It's not true that Israel doesn't recognize the 4th Geneva Conventions. It does. And they are applied by the Israeli Supreme Court. The reason that Bill is incorrect is because, no, that's simply not correct. The reason that Bill is incorrect about his remarks is that while it is unlawful to carry out collective punishment, this is not collective punishment. This is an action against the property that has been used by the individuals that have actually carried out the crime.
Okay, but Bill makes the point that it's not good enough to have a hearing
even if they're
in absentia. If these guys aren't even in court to argue their case, how is that legal?
They have representation in court, and again, if the murderers want to come forward and present themselves to be tried,
suspected murderers,
that would
they
be
have
a wonderful
not been
thing,
convicted.
and I'm sure they will be convicted. But that is correct. They have not been convicted.
And yet their homes have been demolished.
And nor can the state of Israel oppose. They were caught on tape. They were caught on tape as they murdered the 3 boys.
All right,
There's no doubt whatsoever about their identity or the crimes that they carried out. I'm not a court of law, but that does not mean that they're innocent.
Okay, Jeff also made the point that back in 2005...
If I may finish, the point that I was going to make was...
Sorry, I was going to say, back in 2005, an Israeli Army Commission actually did a study, and they found that this deterrent policy, which was actually ineffective, it actually increased hatred amongst Palestinian communities and was ineffective in acting as a deterrent for future attacks. So they abandoned it, largely abandoned it in 2005. So why are they suddenly using it again?
It's not suddenly being used again. It was that particular policy was reconsidered over time. It's been used, I think it was used again about 5 years ago, and the reason was that the authorities decided it actually was an effective deterrent. Now, I'm not an expert on deterrence, and so I can't tell you whether it actually works or not. What I can tell you about is the law, and again, you can have drastic actions against the property of criminals even without criminal trials throughout the Western world. It is not considered a violation of due process. It is not considered collective punishment.
Okay, Jeff, one of the problems, of course, is that earlier this year, as the Israelis were searching for the suspects who had abducted and kidnapped the 3 teenage settlers, there were other Palestinian homes destroyed, which were said to be linked to those involved in this. But of course, as we now know, that wasn't the case. What happens when homes are wrongly destroyed, or what happens to the people whose homes have been destroyed, the families that are in there who have nothing to do with the suspected terrorists?
Well, first of all, of course, it happened in Gaza. When Israel suspected that a soldier had been captured, or kidnapped, as we say, in Rafah, the entire Rafah area was destroyed. 140 Palestinians died, and it turned out the soldier wasn't kidnapped. The soldier had been killed in action. So there's nothing that happens to these people. They simply live in the rubble, and it's not our problem. And in the West Bank, when you have people whose homes are demolished for collateral damage, nothing is done. There's no no compensation. Nothing is done for them. In fact, Israel has demolished 40,000 Palestinian homes in the occupied territory since 1967. And it criminalizes the Palestinians. It doesn't allow them to build homes. It demolishes their homes illegally, completely illegally in international law. And yet the Palestinians are blamed for it, and they have to simply fend for themselves. There's no compensation, there's no acknowledgement, there's no nothing on the part of Israel. They're considered simply criminals because they've tried to have homes under occupation.
Okay, so let's have a look at Israel's justification for demolishing Palestinian homes. They fall into 3 main categories. The first is what Israel calls clearing operations intended to meet military needs. The second is administrative, knocking down houses built without permits. And then there's the demolition of homes as punishment, which we've been talking about. Bill, the demolition of homes without permits, that's an interesting one, because human rights groups say that often Arabs aren't issued with building permits in Arab areas to make it easier for Israelis to later appropriate that land. Is there any truth to that?
It's virtually impossible for Palestinian residents of the West Bank, areas that remain under total Israeli military jurisdiction. This is the area called Area C. It covers about 60 to 62% of the West Bank. In that area, to get a building permit for any kind of land use, whether you want to build a house or a second story on your house or a chicken coop or plant an olive tree, you have to get a permit from the Israeli military. It's extremely difficult to do that. Only about 1% of the land in that area that's controlled completely by the Israeli military is available to Palestinian land use. most of that is already built up, and in more than 94% of the cases, permit applications are rejected. So it's impossible to get a permit to build. One then builds without a permit out of necessity, and then that house gets destroyed. It is not unlawful to destroy houses in occupied territory for imperative military needs, but this is an administrative procedure. This is not fighting going on, tanks have to move, troops have to get around. This is just a very calm situation in which thousands and thousands of people have had their homes destroyed over the years.
And the Israeli government argues that this administrative procedure is applied equally to both Palestinians and Israelis. So Israeli homes, they say, can also be demolished because of building regulation violations. Does it happen on an equal basis?
It does happen from time to time. One does see occasional demolitions of a structure in an unlawful settlement outpost. By unlawful settlement outpost, I'm actually using Israeli legal terminology, which considers the settlements to be perfectly lawful, but that the outposts are not lawful. They don't have the proper permit. So every once in a while, we do see a demolition by the Israeli military of a structure here or there in an outpost, which is illegal even under Israeli law. But of course, the Israeli military also provides security, also helps to facilitate access to road networks, water networks, electricity networks for those supposedly unlawful outposts. And even in the formally recognized settlements themselves, much of the built-up area, as has been documented, is built on privately owned Palestinian land, so which is also actually unlawful under even Israeli law. So if you're talking about, does the Israeli military apply its own law rigorously against settlers who break that law, the answer is clearly no. When it comes to Palestinians who've violated that law, we've seen really thousands of demolitions just over the last few years alone. I think the number is something like averaging 1,000 Palestinians a year are getting their homes demolished in the West Bank.
Avi, do you have a response to that?
Well, there are a lot of charges that he's made there, and I think that a number of them are misleading, but let me just focus on two. First of all, Bill says that it's almost impossible for Palestinians to build because only 1% of Area C is built up land. And it's true that 1% is built up land. It's not true at all that it's impossible for Palestinians to get permits. The reason that very little of Area C is built up land is because that was the basis of the agreements between Israel and the PLO, that all of the built up Palestinian areas went into Palestinian Authority control, into areas A and B, leaving the areas where there were very few Palestinians and almost no Palestinian built-up areas as Area C. And so it's no surprise that there are very few built-up areas. It's not at all true that it's that it's impossible for a Palestinian to get a permit. It's difficult both for Israelis and for Palestinians to get permits. And it is not at all true, at least as far as the last figures that I've seen, that enforcement against Israelis is only occasional, while enforcement against Palestinians is drastic. The last figures that I saw were that the overwhelming majority of unlawful construction, both by Israelis and by Palestinians, remains standing, and that more demolition orders are issued against unlawful Israeli construction than against unlawful Palestinian construction.
Amnesty International wouldn't agree with you. They say that Israel strictly enforces planning prohibitions where Palestinian houses are built, but freely allows amendments to plans where Israelis are setting up settlements. So Amnesty International takes a completely opposite view to what you've just said.
I'm not familiar with the particular Amnesty report, so I can't tell you from where they might have drawn that, but I am familiar with this question, and that's simply not correct. It is difficult both for Israelis and for Palestinians to get building permits. It is not true that it is impossible for Palestinians to get them, and it is not true that that Palestinian illegal construction is demolished while Israeli illegal construction is not. They are both in the main not demolished, but more demolition activities are carried out against illegal Israeli construction.
Okay, Jeff, your own organization produced a report on this back in 2007, and it said that a Jewish house without a permit is just an urban problem, but a Palestinian home without a permit, that is treated as a strategic threat.
That's right. I mean, it's ridiculous what's being said now. You just have to look on the grounds. At the same time that Israel's demolished 40,000 Palestinian homes, it's built more than 100,000 homes illegally for Israeli settlers. in East Jerusalem and the West Bank and Gaza before they were removed. So simply the facts on the ground show that that's simply not the case. That Israel has actually confined the Palestinians to Area C. Even what Avi is saying is ridiculous, because the whole idea of areas A, B, and C would be fluid. And eventually, under Oslo, the whole idea was the whole West Bank would become Area A under Palestinian control. So it wasn't built like that, that Area C was agreed upon as belonging to Israel and it has no Palestinians. In fact, Palestinians have been forcibly expelled from Area C, which is 62% of the West Bank, and the EU has written reports about this forcible expulsion, and Israel wants to annex Area C to itself, so that the Palestinians that are left in Area C simply cannot get building permits. There's about 2.5 million Palestinians in the West Bank. Last year, Israel issued 18 building permits. And at the same time, of course, in the 9 months that the Kerry negotiations were going on, Israel announced the building of about 15,000 housing units during the negotiations. So it's simply not true. It's more than not true. It's a lie to say that Palestinians can build the same way that Israelis do. The government builds for Israeli settlements, and the government destroys the homes of Palestinians.
Bill, how strongly would you put this? I mean, we've said that, or it has been said that this demolition of homes for punitive reasons is against the Geneva Convention, that it's collective punishment. I mean, how strong can we say this? Is this policy of demolishing homes and deliberately displacing families, is that a crime against humanity?
Well, it's pretty clearly a war crime under the Geneva Conventions to forcibly transfer members of the occupied protected population. That sounds like jargon, but basically it just means that if somebody is in an occupied territory, they're the habitual residents there, they're protected by the law of occupation, and one of the protections they get is they cannot be intentionally forced off their lands and out of their communities without some really important military justification, not some administrative procedural justification. And what we're seeing with more than 1,000 Palestinians on average in the last few years getting their homes demolished for purely administrative reasons is obviously a policy designed to kick them out of their communities. You see this even more clearly when groups like the International Committee of the Red Cross have actually given up on trying even to resupply people whose homes have been demolished with emergency tents, because the Israeli military has come in and then demolished the tents, re-traumatizing the people who were just trying to stay on their lands, even in very poor shelter conditions.
Okay, gentlemen.
So that indicates an intention to drive people off of their communities, and that's a war crime. I
know we could talk about this for much, much longer, but we have come to the end of the programme. Gentlemen, I want to thank you all very much indeed for joining us here on Inside Story. Avi Bell and Jeff Halper in Jerusalem, and Bill Van Esvelt in Ramallah. And do add your voice to this discussion. You can leave your comments on facebook.com/